It was a hot sunny day and Mum was busy baking and she said to Joe, "Joe, take Amy out in the garden for me, there's a good boy." "I shan't be long." She put on Amy's sun hat. "Now remember," she said to Amy, "Joe is in charge." Joe groaned. He did love his little sister, but the trouble was, Amy was too small to play any of Joe's games. She couldn't play at pirates on the climbing frame. She kept on falling into the sea. "Watch out, the sharks will get you," Joe told her. But Amy didn't know about sharks. She couldn't play at hospitals. She wouldn't lie down and pretend to be ill. Amy spent too much time lying down in real life. She was far more interested in how Dad's bike worked. "Oh, Amy, look at you," said Joe. And she couldn't play Joe's favourite game either, creepy crawly café. "You mustn't really eat them," said Joe. "Just pretend." Oh, look at that. In fact, the only game Amy liked to play was hide and seek. She loved secret places where she could sit sucking her thumb, hiding until Joe came to find her. She hid in all sorts of places. Behind the wheelbarrow, in the flower bed, under Mum's washing. And when Joe found her, he said, "Oh, there you are." "Boo," said Amy. And she laughed as if it was a real game. Then the minute Joe turned his back, off she went again. Joe began to feel hot and bad-tempered. He didn't want to spend the afternoon searching for Amy. "You're a nuisance and I'm fed up with you," he told her. After that, Joe went back to his cafe and Amy had to wait a very long time to be found. Dad had dug a hole at the end of the lawn to make a sand pit for them. It wasn't finished yet, so there was no sand, but Joe had smoothed out a comfy place for his bottom, where the soil was soft and easy to dig. He made a hole, poured in the water, and stirred it with an old wooden spoon. He loved it when the mud went slip, slop, slurp. On the menu in Joe's cafe were lots of interesting dishes. Joe's cafe. Warm pies and caterpillar cakes, mud-flavoured milkshakes, sloppy spider stew, slug sandwiches, and of course, plenty of plain mud pies. Sometimes Joe carried his mud pies to the front gate to see if there were any customers passing by. Today it was very quiet in the lane, but soon he saw Mrs. Griffiths, who lived at the farm, walking home from the bus. "Would you like to come to my cafe?" Joe called to her. "Oh, I was just thinking about a cup of coffee," said Mrs. Griffiths, "and perhaps a little cake." "I've got some delicious snail buns," said Joe. "Oh, my favourite," said Mrs. Griffiths. He handed her a bucket and a plastic plate, and then Joe passed lots of other things for her to try until all his dishes were lined up outside in the lane. "Oh, I feel better for that," said Mrs. Griffiths. "How much do I owe you?" 10 pence, said Joe. "Oh, what a cheap cafe," she said. "I shall come here again." She gave Joe a new 20-pence piece. "You can keep the change." Then she smiled and waved goodbye. Joe kept opening his fist and looking at the money shining in the sun. And quickly he opened the gate to collect his dishes to take them back to his cafe so that he could make more food to sell. While Joe had been busy selling tea and buns, Amy had found a new secret place to hide, right in the middle of the lilac bush. It was cool and cosy with the smell of lilac all around her. She waited for ages, crushing the lilac flowers between her fingers. But this time Joe never came. He had completely forgotten about Amy. He had forgotten he was in charge. And now, because he was excited and because his hands were full, Joe forgot another very important thing: to close the front gate. Leaving it wide open, he walked back along the path, sat down the soil and started to dig. Look at him. When Amy finally came out of her hiding place, she saw Joe with his back to her, still busy with his cafe. So Amy thought she would do some digging of her own. She found a spade on the path and dug it into the flower bed. popped one of Mum's flowers and fell down on the ground. Amy laughed. "All fall down," she said. She dug up another one on its side too, and a few more along the path until she came to the front gate. When she saw it wide open, Amy smiled, and then, because she was just a baby and there was no one to stop her, she kept on walking out into the lane, dragging the spade behind her. Off she went, wearing only her nappy. Oh no. It was quite some time before Joe missed her. He suddenly noticed how quiet it was. He looked for her in all the usual places. Under the wheelbarrow, in the flower bed, behind the dustbin, under the washing. But Amy was nowhere to be seen. Soon Joe noticed Mum's flowers lying on the soil. He followed the trail to the front gate, which was still wide open. Then Joe knew what had happened. And what's more, Joe knew it was his fault. Joe stepped out into the lane. It was quiet and still. The sun beat onto the road and onto Joe's head. He looked up the lane, which led to a main road. He hoped Amy hadn't gone that way. He looked down the lane, which led to the farm. Perhaps she'd gone that way. But how could he know? There was no one to ask. Joe didn't know what to do next. He knew what he should have done. He should have run straight into the house and told Mum. But Joe didn't do that because he had been left in charge. He desperately wanted to find Amy before Mum realised she was gone. Joe wasn't allowed out into the lane, but he ran quickly to the first house. He went up the path and knocked hard on the door. No one came. The house was silent and empty. Joe tried the next one and the next, but they too seemed to stare at him without answering. By the time Joe reached the last house, he was feeling scared. He had never been this far, all on his own. At last, someone did answer. Mr. Garner opened his door, rubbing his eyes. "Have you seen Amy?" Joe asked him. "I've lost her." But Mr. Garner had been having a nap. He hadn't seen anyone. "Does your mum know you're gone?" Joe shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. "I was supposed to be in charge." "Don't worry," said Mr. Garner. "She can't have gone far on those little legs. You wait while I put my shoes on, then I'll help you find her." Joe sat on a stone by the gate at the end of the lane. The tears ran down his face. He felt someone's hot breath on him. It was Bella, Mr. Garner's dog. Joe stroked her and rested his head against her. "I've lost Amy," he whispered, as if the dog might be able to tell him where to look. But Bella just panted and wagged her tail. Joe had never felt more unhappy in his life. Then, through his tears, he saw Bella slip under the gate and she began to bark. Joe climbed up onto the gate to see why. In the distance, someone was waving. It was Mrs. Griffiths, and by the hand she was leading a small figure wearing only a nappy. "Mr. Garner," Joe called. "I found her." He climbed over the gate and ran as fast as he could to meet them. And when he reached Amy, he hugged her and squeezed her until she could hardly breathe. "I do love you," he whispered, "and you're not a nuisance." But Amy waved him away with a sticky hand waving a large chocolate biscuit. "Wait till Mum sees your face," said Joe. "There was chocolate all over it." Joe pulled up Amy's nappy, which by now was almost around her knees, and took her other hand. He would have liked to carry Amy, but after her adventure, Amy felt far too grown up for that. They said goodbye to Mrs. Griffiths, and then Joe and Amy walked slowly back along the track to where Joe could see Mum waiting with Mr. Garner by the gate. He knew what she would say. "Oh, Joe, how could you?" The tears came at once. "I'm really sorry," he said, and Mum could see he was. She felt too relieved to be angry. She gave him a big hug, and she said, "What we need now is a cup of tea." "You could come to my café," said Joe. "I'll make you nice with a beetle tea." Mum smiled. "Why don't you come to my café instead?" she said. "I finished all that baking." And since it was such a beautiful sunny day, Joe said, "We could have a picnic in the garden, just you and me and Amy." The end.